can I start by saying a very warm welcome to everyone attending today. Thank you for making the time to do so. My name is Nikhil Vaswani, and I am a junior consultant at Turner & Townsend. Today, we're joined by Jess Chai from Turner & Townsend, and today we're going to be hosting a retrofit information support and expertise event, which is fully funded by the Department of Energy, Security and Net Zero and delivered by Turner & Townsend. With that, I'd like to say thank you once again, and I will now hand over to Jess to start today's presentation. Over to you, Jess. Thank you.
Thanks, Nikhil. So yeah, welcome everyone to the Introduction to Data Masterclass that I'll be taking you through. So obviously data is a massive topic, but for this session, we're really going back to basics. So we're going to start with understanding why data is important. Then we'll go into the process in which you might undertake to get your data to the point where it's fit for purpose. That'll include stages like identifying what data you need for your project, where you can source this, how you can collate and cleanse the data before you then come on to analyze it. And of course, we'll finish off with a quick summary. So starting with why data is so important. So there's a lot of ways that data can support you in your organization, and we've just got a few listed here on the slide. So starting with tracking and refining progress towards internal or regulatory standards. So for example, if you've got a target for your own stock for meeting like EPCC, of course, you'll be collecting EPC data to understand how many properties haven't yet reached that target and being able to make the most of the opportunities when they arise. For example, when funding is available from the government for you to apply against. Identifying where data is missing for the most cost-effective surveying. So it's useful to understand where the gaps are in your data so that then you can come to commission surveys or maybe do some research for those particular properties where data is missing. Data can also help you understand what works you need to procure for, so that can then inform contractor activity. And you can also use data to produce meaningful reports, so helping to monitor progress within a project, but also help to update maybe more senior members on where you currently are against your KPIs. Developing a delivery plan, so you can also use data to help you plan ahead, forecast, perhaps even using like lessons learned to anticipate for any challenges and leave contingencies for this. So those are just a few examples of why data is so important, and it's just to emphasize really that it's worth investing both time and money into your data and implementing some sort of management system, because data can bring a lot of benefits like cost savings and savings on resources as well. So how do we prepare data that is fit for purpose? So the data process really begins with understanding what factors are important for you to consider when you come to choose your properties for a project. And this will then go on to inform what data sets you need and where they can be found. If you understand the purpose of your decision making, it can also help with determining how data should be analysed and presented. So when it comes to identifying your data you need, that can also be influenced, of course, by like the criteria of any scheme that you come to apply for. So, for example, previous waves of SHDF, we were looking at properties that were below EPCC. Same with previous phases of HUG, you were looking at below EPCC and off-gas properties, and also potentially income deciles of 1 to 3 for auto-eligible properties. So then once you've identified what kind of data you then need to source the data from reliable places and pull these across, ideally into a centralized database to store securely and also be able to cross-reference between data sets. And it's worth noting that the data that you collect might not always be in the best condition either. So we always recommend to conduct some quality checks and cleanse the data as best as you can. And then once it's in the best state that you can achieve, you can start to then analyze the data based upon the decision making, the purpose of your decision making, and then choosing the properties for your next retrofit project. And at this stage, it's also worth considering if the properties you've chosen are aligned to the strategy that you have for your organization, and whether or not you even have enough properties to begin with to target. And of course, whilst you work through this entire process, it's important to have some kind of data governance process in place, which we're going to delve into very quickly. So any data governance in place should really ideally aim to achieve the 6 data quality dimensions that we've got listed here. So starting with accuracy, data is accurate when it reflects reality and is correct. So, for example, a common one that we've been hearing from those that are delivering on Wave 2.1 is that when they come to do their desktop studies, a property comes up as EPCD on the certificate, but then when they come to do the retrofit assessments, in reality, that property is actually an EPCC. So that means the original data is inaccurate. And of course, this can affect whether the property is eligible for funding, which is why it's so important to check for these inaccuracies, because it could mean that the aims or benefits that you set out to achieve might not be actually possible, and then could result in a loss of money with you having to go out and do more retrofit assessments or having to go back to the drawing board to find more properties that could potentially be targeted. So then you've got completeness. So data completeness is when you've got all the required data in that data set to fulfill its intended purpose. So it's about ensuring that all the data fields present, they contain the right data for the job. Then consistency, so that refers to how well the values and formatting in the data set link to one another, that the values don't conflict throughout the data set. So for example, using postcodes, the format of this should be pretty consistent, whether that be, the normal format, which is the 3 or 4 characters with a space, and then the final 3 characters. Some others, like to do it in a different way with just the letters together and then all the numbers together. So yeah, just making sure that that is consistent. Then we've got timeliness, which is referring to how easily the data is available as and when it's needed. Uniqueness is when the information in the data set only appears once and there are no duplicates. And then validity, which is how much the data conforms to the correct format, type, or range. So the data has to exist within the correct boundaries for it to be considered valid. And to use postcodes as an example again, in order for a postcode to be valid, it would need to be within the Royal Mail postcode database. So those are the 6 data quality dimensions. And yeah, as I say, it's important to consider this as part of your data governance so that to ensure that your data continues to be fit for purpose. So going back to that process map that we saw earlier, we're going to go into detail into each stage now. So starting with the identification of data. If you were to start your retrofit projects from scratch, you might like to start thinking quite widely. Like, for example, your organization strategy. Do you have any EPC targets or perhaps fuel poverty targets that you'd want to consider when you come to look at your data sets and choosing your project? Maybe there's a certain approach that you'd like to take with your retrofit project with targeting specific archetypes, in which case that will point you to needing a lot more property focused data. So looking at construction type, the year that the property was built, what measures might have already been done in those. You might also want to consider perhaps the demographic of your residents to support with engagement, or even, if you've got any internal strategies or targets like EDI, fuel poverty, and you want to consider targeting those properties first. Might also be useful to think ahead and use lessons learned again with any barriers that might exist or come across in your project. So, for example, a common one is planning consent, which means that it could be a good idea to get data like conservation areas, national parks, areas of natural beauty ahead of time so that you can consider that when you come to choose your project. So yeah, we've got listed here some of the data that you might need to develop your project. There's a lot of property related data, of course. So things like construction age, detachment, floor area, wall construction, what measures it's had installed. Also useful to collect more geographical data. So like I mentioned, the conservation area to help inform what approach you might need to take for like certain properties. It might also highlight, certain measures that would be allowed or not allowed, and also indicate that you need to engage with your planning department early on. And then we've got listed other bits of data that might be useful for retrofit projects. For example, the getting in touch with your DNO, knowing which DNO is in your area. This is quite a common one that's come up from those that are delivering 2.1 at the moment, having difficulty getting in touch with their DNO because they're wanting to install air source heat pumps, or perhaps they need a disconnection to a property in order to install EWI. So it's important just to consider that at the very beginning. And then other things like knowing what planned works you have perhaps for certain properties so that you can maybe maximize on efficiencies. If you've already got people coming in to do windows and doors, you've got scaffolding up, well, you might as well take advantage of that and do EWI at the same time if it's appropriate for that property. And then on the right, we've got listed some socioeconomic data, which we talked about earlier, could support with resident engagement or some of your more wider organization goals. So things like IMD and the 9-component indices, which consists of like income, disability, crime, and employment. You've got ethnicity data as well that might be useful, especially if your organization has an EDI strategy, and other things like fuel poverty and age as well. So it's just worth noting that this, of course, isn't an exhaustive list of all the possible data that you might consider. But I mean, in my opinion, I think it's a pretty good start for you to be able to start searching where you could possibly get things from and pull them together. And then in terms of actually sourcing that data, we've got listed here some of the possible places that you might choose to explore. So luckily, a lot of the data types that we mentioned earlier can be found bunched together. So for example, open databases, the EPC Communities database has majority of the property data on there. Government databases also have spatial data for like conservation areas, national parks and areas of natural beauty, which is especially useful if any of you have like GIS mapping software. That might also help you to identify an area-based approach as well. And then there's also an open database for the IMD data, which also breaks it down into the 9 indices of deprivation. Other places you might want to look at, so internal departments, you've got your repairs team, housing team, private housing team, or maybe neighbourhood managers for property data, and also things like sensitive resident data like benefits, which you've seen on perhaps previous schemes of like sustainable warmth, LAD and HUG. This is where that really comes into use. And it's only possible to get that through, of course, internal departments, and you'd need to get a data sharing agreement in place. It's worth exploring this early on because it can take quite a bit of time in order to get that going, or alternatively could try and ask those teams to provide the data anonymously. And then you've got your asset management teams. So you'll have more property data there again, so EPC on or off gas data, tenure and planned works. Census data, of course, will contain a lot of socioeconomic data, age, household composition, disability and ethnicities. You can also find a lot of this on the Office for National Statistics website. And then finally, local knowledge, which people tend to undervalue, but actually is incredibly useful because there might be details that, or things that you've experienced with residents firsthand that can't be or weren't captured on the system, which can provide then more context for your project. So we're talking things like complaints, engagement preferences, feelings towards retrofits, that sort of thing. So those are the sources. And then once you've got all your data, you're coming to collate it together. And we've talked about, wanting to put this all into a centralized place. And this is to create that one source of truth. So if you're storing your data in multiple places, it can be quite time consuming to update each individual data set, and then keeping track of which ones you've updated and which ones you haven't, and trying to communicate this across to different teams as well who will have different updating schedules. It can just all get very messy. So we do recommend putting it all into one place for that one source of truth. You can see in that diagram there, for example, these sorts of data like the demographic, the renewals and repairs, planned maintenance, the HH, SRS and stock condition stuff is normally stored in various different places around an organization. But having them all together in one place can help you to understand your properties better and support with a targeting strategy. So, for example, if your renewals and repairs record states that you've just had a new boiler put in, you might not want to be thinking about upgrading the heating system just yet. So having that sort of be cross-referenced with all of your EPC data is quite useful. And then, of course, once all the data is collated and ideally in one central place, make sure that you regularly check, update and back up your data, as part of that bigger data governance process. So when we come to when you've collated your data, now you need to be thinking about cleansing your data. So here at TNT, there's normally 3 sort of checks that we recommend to achieve those sort of like data quality dimensions we talked about earlier. So logic checks, and these checks partly rely on your technical knowledge. So for example, if we were to check cavity wall properties, if we look at that particular component on a spreadsheet and we look at the ages as well, we know that, cavity wall properties weren't really common until about the 1920s, 1930s. So if you look at that particular bit in the database and you're filtering for properties that were built, pre-1900s, and they state then next to it, oh, these are cavity wall, that sort of thing that flags, you might want to go check that again. And you can possibly go on, like, Google Maps is a good one. I do that pretty common on some of the commissions that we do, to double check and look at the bricklaying patterns to see if it actually is cavity wall or not. And then you can go then to fix it in the database. Then you've also got consistency checks. So things like removing duplicates. And there's a handy dandy tool in Excel which can actually do it for you. I think it's part of the conditional formatting bit, the toolbar at the top. And then other things like plausibility checks, which more rely on your local knowledge. So for example, if you've got certain heating types that are cropping up in your data, or the open EPC database says that you have but you're not actually aware of, that might also be one to explore. And also, like, construction materials, if you've got a property that's got cob walls and that's not particularly common in your area, again, it's something that's flagged and you should be having a look, investigating further. So once you've gotten your data to the best possible quality you can achieve, with the resources that you have, it's worth exploring, where the weaknesses are, just to understand how it could possibly impact the decision making or your choice of projects, but also note then how to improve for future. So it's very normal to have data issues. Nothing is perfect. We've tried to list here some of the common issues that we've all come across. So for example, old data, obviously this isn't great, as a lot of it might be outdated. So we would really recommend, verifying how accurate it is by checking it against other data sets that you might have, or even completed retrofit assessments. And then incorrect data, the amount of incorrect data can be limited through, thorough examination of your data and conducting those checks that we went through earlier. You might have pulled also data sets from different sources containing the same information, but they don't quite match, in which case you'll have to assess, which sort of source is more reliable. And you might want to consider a number of things within that. So maybe even, what year the data set was from, how each data set is governed from the source that you've taken it from, was it updated regularly, things like that. You can have conflicts within your data source as well. So again, having to use other fields or other data sources to confirm what's correct. For example, if you've got like a block of flats and all of them say they are flats except for one, then it's highly likely that the odd record is incorrect. Again, you can use Google Maps to try and find out if there are any inaccuracies there. If you've got missing data, you might have to start about conducting surveys on those properties where data is missing, or maybe looking at other archetypes that you could use as a representative example. Those of you that might have modeling software, you might be able to clone data in order to help fill some of those blank spots, but it's worth noting that the confidence level of it might not be great. And then other limitations to keep in mind is, of course, of EPC data, it's only as accurate as the information that the DEA enters. So if they have incorrectly entered anything and you're using it to clone data or to model, it will, of course, affect the accuracy of the results. Another thing to note is the scale of your data. So when you come to collate everything together, cross-reference, you might note that the scale of things might not match up. So for example, all of your property data is on a postcode level, but when you come to cross-reference and match with things like socioeconomic data, so IMD, ethnicity, they might be on an LSOA or even an MSOA scale. So it's just noting that, there are some mismatches in scale there. And then finally, the age of your data. So it's worth keeping in mind that some of the data that you use might not be the most up to date. One data set that comes to my mind in particular that I've always worked with is the fuel poverty data set that's released by the government. So even though there might be a data set released this year, it's actually data from 2 years ago. So it's worth, noting that. And then analyzing your data. So of course, when you come to analyze, or at least what we recommend is you first calculate your baseline, and the baseline obviously means the starting point of the property and then can be used to compare back to as your project progresses. So baseline performance can be calculated for each property or an average across the whole stock. And some of the common metrics that we have to calculate for the baseline is just listed there on the right. So you've got heat demand, which obviously is a measure of how much energy is required to heat a space. You've got the SAPS score and EPC rating, average fuel bills as well, energy consumption, and just, yeah, making note of other general attributes for your baseline performance. So things like insulation type, glazing type, heating source, tenure, that sort of thing. And if you've got modeling software, you might be able to use that also to help you calculate your baseline performance from that. So once you've got your baseline, you can start to analyze the data for the particular project or strategy that you're wanting to deliver. So here you might want to be now filtering for the scheme criteria or organizational targets, looking at the approaches that you might want to take. So whether that be on like an area basis for efficiencies, or maybe you're looking at a particular archetype kind of approach, or even the socioeconomic routes that we mentioned earlier and targeting your properties in like fuel poor areas, for example. And there's a lot of tools available to help you analyze your data. So you've got Excel, obviously, which we're all quite familiar with. There's other modeling softwares out there, which I would recommend, if you're pursuing that route, make sure you research a few different ones to compare against. You've also got Power BI to create dashboards, or even GIS mapping if that's available in your organization to help create some visual maps, and that can also help you identify area-based approaches or understanding where the measures are needed across your stock. Which tool you choose to use may be completely dependent on your confidence of each one, or even the approach that you're deciding to take. I will say that as part of the RISE offering that we do have data support, and it's a service that can help you do some of this data analysis if you're eligible, and we can also do some mapping as well. And to access this, you'll need to have completed our self-assessment and just ticked the privacy and data management policies. Nikal, if I can ask you to drop a link to the self-assessment if anyone is interested in getting that support, then yeah, please do. I really do encourage it.
Sure thing, Jess.
Thank you. And then that's pretty much it. So a quick summary, it's more like a bit of a checklist so that it's useful for you all if you're starting your projects. You can work through this. So obviously we talked about 5 different steps that you can choose. 5 different steps for the data process. So you've got identification, thinking about what data you want and what data you want to get together for identifying what projects you want to do. And that will help you to draw a conclusion in which to base your decision on. Then actually sourcing that data, checking whether or not it's a reliable source, but also ensuring that you've exhausted all avenues to get to your data. Collating it, of course, into a centralized place that will become the single source of truth. And then cleansing your data using that logic, consistency, plausibility check before you then go on to analyze and identify your projects. So that's mainly it. Hopefully we've covered the basics of data within this session, and I hope you found it useful.